Okay, in this video, I'm going to do a quick summary on Essay 2, or part of Essay 2 on the genealogy of morality by Nietzsche. And specifically, Nietzsche gives this account of what he calls guilt or bad conscience. And the reason I thought it was necessary to give a quick summary is he seems to give different accounts, one for guilt and one for bad conscience, and seems to treat them also as the same thing. And so the question for me was, why are there two accounts if we're treating them as the same thing? My interpretation is that there's two aspects to guilt or to bad conscience. And one aspect is just a feeling of awfulness. When you do something bad and you feel guilty, you feel a certain distinct kind of awfulness. But there's also the thought, an accompanying thought of obligation. If, for example, we had scheduled to meet up for coffee and I forgot about it, then I will not only feel bad, I say, I'm sorry, I feel bad, but also I recognize in my mind that I should have showed up and that I had an obligation to do so. It'd be weird to say that I know I'm guilty, but I had no obligation. That just makes no sense. So one way that I'm going to read Nietzsche is that there's two accounts accounting for these different aspects for it. So the first account about the obligation starts with this idea of trade. Okay. Trade is just the familiar sense of trading goods, selling, buying, exchanging this for that. And, we're very familiar with the economy, but he's thinking about very early prehistory. So it's not something like you would, not just the trade you find today in the stock exchange, but something like maybe I'll trade you some strawberries for some cherries that you found or something like that. And interestingly enough, I'm not going to discuss, but he does make the claim that trade in some sense creates and makes a stronger claim, even constitutes things like reason, in the sense of like the ability to reason, thinking, calculation. These sorts of things, he doesn't tell us why and how he thinks this. I would love to know the answer. Themselves enable or have an idea of equivalence. So now you form a concept, and let me move this down so it's not right in my face. These contain this sort of concept of equivalence. Anything can be traded. And so how does this relate now to guilt? Imagine this idea of where, now let's go ahead and relate this. I harm you or injure you in some way. That's what he calls it. Injure. So I still say you're a cow, and now I owe you it. But let's say I ate the cow. Now I don't have any cow to give you. I still, in the sense, the idea is coming back from trade. Trade has the ideas of right. A debt is something you owe. So if you're in debt, you owe something to the creditor. And so you start thinking about this in terms of, you might think about this in terms of a debt. This is now a debt. Now, if you now believe anything can be traded, what can this be traded for? It's just stealing from the math department here. He calls it a particular kind of pain. This is a strange part about Nietzsche. He thinks that when there's an equivalent, if this is equivalent to that, there's a reason for that, right? So, stepping away from for a side, if I steal your chips and then I decide to pay you back with some broccoli or something or some celery, you'd be like, well, no, that's not equivalent. The broccoli doesn't give me the same satisfaction as the chips. So if I've harmed you in some way, he thinks this is what we usually do. We'll inflict some sort of pain on the person, and he thinks we accept that because in our nature, at some level, we think the pain we cause to someone is equivalent to what they stole or took, or the harm they gave to us. What's really crazy about Nietzsche is he thinks of the satisfaction resting in some sort of contempt. What kind of contempt? A sort of looking down upon. The sort of pain you inflict on someone, not in all cases, but in the specific case when you are also taking power over them and looking down upon them. And so he thinks the sort of satisfaction he's identifying is that. Okay, but see, in this sort of sense, when you've done the wrong, when you've done the harm, you're in a sort of debt, and it's from all this ties back to trade, and trade itself has this idea of obligation. I give you one thing, you owe me another thing, and he says that is the very explanation of obligation. Okay, so let's go ahead now and talk about the awfulness. I'm going to go ahead and erase all this. Okay, now to go on, imagine I have captured a tiger represented by this terrible drawing here. It's a wild tiger, and I'm going to go ahead and put the tiger into a cage. Now, it's a wild tiger. What's going to happen? It's going to be in there, and it's going to be looking at me, and it's going to say, as soon as, if I could only get out of this cage, I would go and eat that human. It's not necessarily that the tiger's mad at me or anything. It's just, it's a tiger. So Nietzsche thinks about humans as well as having instincts, and prior to being in society, they have aggressive, but the way he describes them is very cruel instincts. And they have they're violent. They attack each other. They fight with one another. They go to war, but they're living in the world uninhibited, just like you would see a tiger just roaming around, doing whatever he wants to do. Nietzsche sees humans doing that. At the next point in stage, a group of humans dominates them. So we might call them putting them in a cell. Also puts them in a cell. Probably he was thinking of slavery as well, but he's really thinking of these as a social power. He's really thinking about this as a sort of getting the human and forcing them into customs, into norms and standards. Which kinds of standards? Well, the kinds that are appropriate for society. The ones that are appropriate for society are the ones that are not cruel. But just as the tiger before, the human has, has his instincts. He thinks this is an abrupt change. This isn't like a slow evolutionary change. This is a sudden season, and one point he calls it like a thunder, that the oppressors come like a thunder, just loud and inevitable, and it just changes everything. So here's the human, or the group of people that are oppressed. Now their inhibitions, which cannot be expressed, turn towards themselves. They turn into themselves. And he thinks this creates bad conscience. Why? It's not entirely clear. He doesn't give us an explanation of how or why this occurs. The most sense I can make of it is, since you have these sort of attitudes that need to be expressed in these sort of aggressive tones or negative tones, and they don't go out, I guess they start internalizing. As a matter of fact, he doesn't just think bad conscience arises out of this, but in some sense a robust mental life. So he writes about this being the beginning of the soul, and he calls this an internalization. So he thinks that, at this point there wasn't this really rich, robust interior mental life that exists only after this has come about. All right, but that is also going to include bad conscience. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense to you and it helps you read through some of the text. Again, this was Essay 2 of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality.